history.
Ma'am,
Yes.
ma'am, it's just a suggestion that ma'am that can we start with first 10th history, ma'am, because more questions are asked from 10th history rather than 9th history. Ma'am, it's just a suggestion. Rest is up to you.
Yeah, that doesn't actually matter because we need to do both of them either ways. Okay. And in fact, standard 9th history is much more interesting than standard 10th history.
Okay, ma'am. No problem, ma'am. Ma'am,
Okay.
and one more thing, ma'am, that Adinath told me to tell you, ma'am, that he won't be able to attend class today. So, could you please send the recording on the group? It's just a message by Adinath.
Yes, I will. Okay. So let's start. The first chapter is something that you all would have done over some point or in some standard. It's a very basic history chapter called Sources of History. So I'll just share my screen and we'll just do this via PPT. So sources of history, as we all know, tells us about, it basically gives us information about the places from which we can know what happened in history, at what point of time it happened, what are the sources from which we know whether a temple was built or a book was written by some person who was traveling. It gives us numerous information. It gives us a lot of information about many things. So here we go, starting with the first chapter, that is sources of history. Now, remember that history is divided into three main periods: the ancient, the medieval, and the modern. For us, Indian history, we consider ancient history to be the Indus Valley civilization. Now, everything that happened with the coming of the Aryans till the Mughal period, we consider that to be the medieval age of history or the medieval period of history. And after that, we talk about the modern period, which is mainly about coming of the Britishers. Okay. So you all need to remember that, or practically understand that we have more sources of history when it comes to the modern period. A lot of more written resources or sources when it comes to the modern period. We also have quite a few, or yeah, you can say quite a few, your architectural as well as written resources when it comes to the medieval period. So we'll just go through that. We are mainly concentrating on the modern period of history over here in this chapter. So when we come to the type of sources, there are two main type of sources. They are divided into two main parts. The first is your written sources and the second is your material sources. Now, as the name suggests, written sources is something that is written, something that can be read. These are the things that are preserved in archives, in libraries for us to refer to them. So these are the written sources. Material sources as those sources which we can see and which are present in various places. So these are the two main sources. Some examples of written sources will be newspapers, periodicals, which are again a type of newspapers or magazines which follow a specific time period, like a weekly or a bi-weekly or a monthly magazine. We have encyclopedias, which are like a storehouse of information, postage stamps, government gazettes. Government gazettes will mainly display what are the things that you have, the government is planning, what are its various policies that are in the making, what has been the debates about, how is the government handling certain issues, etc. Documents in archives. Now, archives are really important. What are archives? It's like a library, but where all the official and historical documents are preserved. That place is called archives. Then we have diaries. Now, these diaries could be diaries of some leaders, diaries of common people, diaries maintained by the travelers who came to our country or who went to other places. So, diaries are a very, very precious written source because they serve the first-hand information. Okay. Like suppose if I'm writing a diary, that becomes the first-hand information. I've written that myself. So diaries are very reliable. But one thing that we need to understand when it comes to diaries, is that it always has the perspective of the person who's writing it. So in some places, you might realize that the opinion is very biased. Now you would feel this because your personal opinion would differ from the opinion written in the diary. So the biggest advantage of diary, it gives first-hand information. The biggest disadvantage of the diary is that yes, it at times would be a very biased opinion, or an opinion that would suit the writer. Last, we go to letters. So letters are also stored in archives. Now these are not just any letters, but letters written by some important people, some leaders, like for example letters written by Gandhiji to Hitler, these kind of letters, or these are just some examples. These kind of letters which would be preserved mainly in the archives. So these are your written sources, very important. Yes, also Abraham Lincoln. Now coming to the material sources, as we all know, material sources are sources that we can see. Now here we have coins. Uh, Coins are very important. We'll be discussing about this later as well. What do coins tell you? First of all, we need to know the material of the coin. If the coins are made of gold, we would know that the empire was very prosperous. If they are made of silver or bronze, we will say that it was an okay empire, not so prosperous. So these are the kinds of information coins give you. We'll be coming to that a little later. Next, places of worship. Places of worship, we mean the church, mosques, temples, etc. So places of worship are very important. They tell us about the deity that was worshipped, the way the rituals were done, what were the sacrifices performed, who performed them. If there were a lot of temples, we would know that yeah, maybe the people were very religious, or the kings themselves were very religious. So we have one example from the Mesopotamian civilization in site which was called Ur. There, all the main activities of the empire were carried out inside the temple. So the temple was very huge. It was a structure in the center, bounded by walls on all the four sides, and it had rooms on all the four sides where all their economic activities were carried out. So here, this is what the places of worship tells us. Next, we go to ornaments. Again, ornaments are a very important material source. Again, telling you about the prosperity mainly of that empire or of that time. It would also tell you about the kind of materials that were considered as precious, as semi-precious, or just like a local material. It could also tell you about the division of classes in society, whether a rich class person wore what kind of jewelry, a lower class person wore what kind of jewelry. Uh, a lot of jewelry ornaments are also found in burial sites, which tell us that people at times believed in life after death. What was the kind of material they used? Was it found in India, or was it imported from somewhere? It gives us a whole lot of information. Next, we go to museums. Now, museums are nothing, but it's just a place where we have a lot of our cultural artifacts, a lot of our cultural heritage on display. I'm sure you guys have must have visited some museum at one point of time or the other. So this is what museums are all about. They just display things from different time periods, which we consider very important for our heritage. Next, clothing. Clothing is again an important material source because it tells you the types of clothes people wore, what were the materials they wore. Was it again like ornaments? Was it made over here? Was it imported from somewhere? What was the sewing style? What were the patterns? Were the clothes embroidered or were they plain? Etc. Steel. Seals are very important. They are proof of long distance trade or also trade within the country, within the land. Seals just serve as a confirmation that whatever I'm sending it to you, whatever I'm exporting to you, is properly sealed and packed. So you should receive it with the seal intact, which will tell you that yes, the stuff has reached to me properly. But they do give us a lot of information about the king, the year, maybe the weightage, what was contained inside. Next, going on to architecture. Architecture gives us a lot of information. Again, architecture would include your places of worship. Apart from that, it would include palaces, gardens, parks, everything that was made by the king. Schools, it could be universities, like we have the Nalanda University made during the Mauryan Empire. Whether the king built wells for the people, or were they building canals during the later stages of civilization. So architecture gives us a lot of information. Lastly, we have things of daily use. Now, things of daily use could just contain, maybe some utensils that they found in the palace or even in the Indus Valley civilization. It could tell us about also sometimes the charred food grains or the seeds that are left over. It would tell us about what kind of vegetables, what kind of fruits, what kind of grains they used. So, types of resources, yes, widely divided between two, written and material. We cannot say that one is more important than the other. They both are equally important. So, obviously, written sources increased or kept on increasing as we come towards the modern age, because people started getting more and more literate, and so they started writing more. So, comparatively, yes, material sources are they are going on, or we are looking at material sources right from the ancient period, but written sources, it's relatively quite recent. Now, first we are going to concentrate on the written resources. Now, the first and the most important written resource is the newspaper. I'm sure you all must have seen newspapers in your house. We have n number of newspapers today, a lot of English newspapers, and hundreds and thousands of regional language newspapers as well. Newspapers are like a storehouse of information. You will find everything from everything starting from current affairs to the entertainment industry like Bollywood, to sports, to also some kind of entertainment that you have, like you have some puzzles and you have your horoscopes in the newspapers, you have advertisements in your newspapers. So a lot of things found in the newspapers, they tell us a lot of things about human life, everything that starts with us: politics, economy, our social life, current affairs, new types of art, some literature festivals, or someone has written a new book and they are inaugurating the book. So, a lot of information contained in the newspapers. So, if you look at a newspaper today, the first page will show you the price, show you the weather of the day, it will tell you what date is it, many things like this. So they give you information about current affairs, international and national news. It improves our knowledge and it keeps us updated. It's very important that we read newspapers because we should know what is going on in our country and what are the international affairs that are very, very relevant to our country right now. So reading newspapers for that reason is a very good habit. One new revolution that very recently, which we have seen when it comes to newspapers, is that almost all the apps are now available on the Play Store. So we can download the Times of India app, we can download the Indian Express app, and we can read newspapers on the go. So I don't really now need to buy a newspaper. I can very easily download the app on my phone and start reading the news. Wherever I go, I can read the news in my free time whenever it is convenient. So that's the new revolution that technology has brought about. Now, coming over here, when we are talking of newspapers, this is the very first newspaper published in our country. It was called Hickey's Bengal Gazette. So I'm sorry, the picture is a little hazy. Okay, because it's a very, very old newspaper and a clear picture was not available. So as you can see, the newspaper has two sides which we can see and two sides which we cannot see. So a newspaper that was just four sides of paper. Again, it was a weekly newspaper. The reason why now we have so many newspapers and so many newspaper supplements or so many sites to read in a single newspaper is all the revolution of the press, all the revolution of the printing press. Also over here you can see in the picture that there are no colors used, there is only black ink, there are no pictures, nothing. It's just written stuff, just information that they want to give to the people. Now, some interesting facts about this Hickey's Bengal Gazette. It is the first published newspaper of India. It was published by James Augustus Hickey, and this newspaper was also called the Calcutta General Advertiser. So you can see it over here, Calcutta General Advertiser. It was a weekly newspaper sold at rupees 1, and 400 copies were sold per week. That's it. Just 400 copies. Now, it was founded on 29th January 1780 and seized, means it stopped on 30th of March 1782. So it just lasted for hardly 2 years. Now, it was seized by the government as per the order of the Supreme Court, and it was auctioned and sold to the India Gazette. Now, over here, what we mean by government is the British Indian government. Obviously, because this newspaper gave out information about the Britishers, which was not really well written or not clearly in favor of the Britishers. So the Britishers did something to stop this, and so they seized the newspaper and sold it to the India Gazette. Now, India Gazette was a newspaper which was started by the Britishers, and it was in favor of the Britishers. So now its headquarters were at 67 Radha Bazar, Calcutta, and it had one slogan, open to all parties but influenced by none. Now it's a very, very powerful slogan which is telling you that basically we are publishing the ideas of all the political parties, or if not political parties, we are publishing the ideas of all the different people, but we are not influenced by any one idea. We are just giving you their ideas, but we are not in favor of anyone. This clearly speaks, the slogan clearly gives us a message that the newspaper was not at all biased, and it gave a very fair opinion to everything. Now, recently, obviously, newspapers have been changed, modified, as we already discussed. You can look at this newspaper, try to just remember or recollect the picture of this newspaper, and look at the newspaper that you get in your houses today. There's a complete transformation that you will see. Okay, so from here next, we move on to the PTI, that is the Press Trust of India. Now, the Press Trust of India is the largest news agency in India. So what it does is PTI basically, it does not have a newspaper of its own or anything like that. It's just trying to regulate what is being printed in the news, and it's also trying to regulate the kind of information that reaches the newspaper owners so that they can put in that particular information in the newspaper. So see, when it comes to our country and government, not all information can be published. There is some information which has to be kept classified. So it is like an important source of details of important events and articles which everybody can refer to. So it was established on 27th August 1947, very soon after our independence. The largest news agency in India. It has its headquarters at New Delhi. Now it provides reports, photographs, I'm sorry, the spelling is wrong. Provides reports, photographs, articles on financial and scientific issues to newspapers. So yes, the newspapers do rely on the PTI sometimes for some information that they want to publish. Okay. Now it has started an online service. Obviously, we know how important technology is and online stuff is now. So they do had to go online. So it started its online service. From the 1990s, it started using satellite broadcast technology as well. Now, PTI has provided really important material in the history of modern India. Its chairman currently is Avik Savarkar, and the editor-in-chief is Mr. Vijay Joshi. So this is the logo of the PTI, the Press Trust of India. This is its main office, the headquarters. Now, a very, very important part of your chapter is the postage stamps. I'm sure you all know what stamps are and that you have seen some stamps. Stamps are very, very important. They give us a lot of information. Now here you can see there are many, many different types of stamps. Just look at it for a minute. If you try to notice, it has our flag. It has some important personalities. Though it's a little blurry, but still you can make out this is some animal. National emblem, Gandhiji, Mother Teresa, a bird flying, the horse. Okay. So now coming this, the skinned dock. This is the first ever stamp which was introduced in India. So you can see it's the skinned district dock. So now the Indian Post Office was established in 1837. But Asia's first adhesive stamp matlab a stamp which could be stuck to your letter. It's called the skinned dock. It was introduced in 1852 by Sir Bartle Frere, the British East India Company's administrator of the province of Sindh. So again, if you see the newspaper, sorry, not the newspaper, the postage stamp has been published or was for the first time introduced by a Britishers. Like many times you will see most of our institutions or most of the styles of court or the styles of governance or the styles of education also that we follow have all been inspired by the Britishers. So the first postage stamp in India also introduced by the Britisher, and this is how it looked. Now, these are two very, very important stamps. Now, as you will see over here also, they tell you the price. The stamp will also give you the price of the stamp, that is half an anna. So over here you can see it is 3.5 annas. Here it is 1.5. Now this where we see it's Jai Hind, the date is 15th August 1947, talking about mainly our independence. So this is the first stamp of independent India, shows the new Indian flag. It was meant for foreign correspondence. So any letters that I want to sell, or sorry, that I want to post internationally, I will use this stamp. Now you cannot use all stamps for any purpose. You will have to use particular stamps for some particular purposes. So this was used for foreign correspondence. This stamp over here where you see the Ashoka lions, that is our emblem. This was used for domestic use. So if I'm sending some letter to somebody within the country, within India, I will be using this stamp. Also, that is the reason you can see the difference in the prices of the stamp. This is 3.5 annas, this is 1.5 anna. So this is how both the stamps looked. Now here, obviously Bapu, father of our nation, Gandhiji, obviously there has to be some stamp for him. Now you can see it's the same stamp of Gandhiji, but it's in different colors. And so is the price of each stamp, 1.5, 3.5, 12, and 10. So Gandhiji is the first living Indian to feature on the postage stamp of India. Okay. And a memorial to Mahatma Gandhi was issued on 15th August 1948 on the first anniversary of independence. So these are some of the stamps Many more stamps, you can find many more stamps with Gandhiji, but these are the two most famous. So this is 5 rupees because it was the centenary, 100 years of his birth. Apart from this, we have had stamps on Mr. Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan. He was the then Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan stamp, the then Prime Minister of India, was released during his lifetime. So while he was alive, his stamp was released. So here again, you can see that there are two types of stamps mainly. One is this and one is over here. Now, Jal Cooper stamp. This is very, very important. This part in your book, the Jal Cooper stamp. Who was Jal Cooper? He was a famous philatelist. A philatelist is a person who loves to collect stamps. Okay. This that you see, the Jal Cooper stamp, was introduced by the government in the year 1997. Jal Cooper was an expert on the subject of postage stamps. He edited the India Stamp Journal. He founded the Philatelic Bureau in India and founded the Empire of India Philatelic Society. So he has played a very important role, a very pivotal role when it comes to the study of postage stamps in India. And he also took the study of Indian postage stamps to the international level. So Jal Cooper stamp, very, very important. And this guy is very important whenever we talk about stamps. So these are some of the written sources of history that we saw going back. So mainly we did the newspapers. After that, we did your postage stamps. So we are concentrating on these two main things for this chapter. Now next we are going to the material sources of history. First of all, we are going to coins. So here you can see, what do you see on the coins? If you have any coin around you, you can also pick it up and try and see what is on that coin. First of all, it will show you the value of that coin, 1 rupee, 2 rupee, 5 rupee, 10 rupees. It will tell you the year in which the coin was made. This is one moher, 1862, with Queen Victoria. This is again Queen Victoria, 1 rupee, again the same year, 1862. And some of the coins that you can see over here, these are this extreme right hand side bottom. You can see the coins that we use currently, the 10, the 5, the 2, and the
Ma'am,
5.
one moher is equal to how much rupees currently?
That was the currency at that time, so you cannot really make out much, but yes, today its value would be quite a lot.
Okay, ma'am.
Okay, so moher was the currency basically, or it was as said by the Britishers. At that time they referred to moher. At that time, not exactly rupees, so they kind of referred to moher. So today, if you are to get this coin at an auction, it would cost you somewhere around 1.5 lakh for one coin, 1 to 1.5 lakh, if it is auctioned. So that's the price that you would pay for this. And at that time, see, more than the price of the coin, the material in which the coin was made was more important. Okay. Moher was a coin that was made in gold. So obviously one moher was very, very valuable at that time. So general estimate is that at that time, if you're talking about the year 1862, if you give one moher, you would get 15 1 rupee these silver coins in exchange. So kind of difficult to estimate the current value, but yes, one moher, if it is gold, the most valuable coin at that time. So one thing please remember clearly, that at that time the material of the coin was more important than its actual value. It was considered basically something above the rupees. मतलब रुपये के ऊपर कुछ है तो वो that is moher. So these are some of the coins that you see. Now, can anyone tell me who issues coins in India right now?
RBI.
Reserve Bank of
Yes,
India.
yes. The Reserve Bank of India. It started issuing coins from the year 1935. Okay, some facts that I want to tell you over here is that the first paper currency, not talking about the coins, paper currency, that is our notes, issued by RBI was a 5 rupee note, and it had the picture of King George VI, and it was released in January 1938. Now, till some years ago, till 2005, the 5 rupee coins were made from brass, but now from 2005, it is made from ferritic stainless steel, the bifurcation of which is 83% iron and 17% chromium. Now, our paper notes are made of cotton and cotton rag. Now, how they are made, only the RBI knows, for the obvious reason to prevent the duplication of notes and currency. Now, recently, since a few years, we have started seeing a new rupee 10 coin. So, see, the inside part is silver and the outside part is golden like brass like color. Now, the outer ring is aluminium bronze. It has 92% copper, 6% aluminium, and 2% nickel. And the center, the silver part, is cupronickel. It has 75% copper and 25% nickel. So these are some facts about coins. Okay. So coins are a very, very important material source of history. They also tell us, if we are studying any empire, it will also tell us how much money they had in rotation in their empire. Were coins very common, or were they only to be kept by a privileged few of the empire? So they give us a lot of information. If coins that we find in India, like these kind of coins issued by some empires in India, like the Kushans, etc., and if they are found in the Roman Empire of that time, or on some other empire that maybe existed in Europe, it will give you evidences of long distance trade. It will tell you that trade existed that time as well. It will tell you that globalization existed that time as well. So coins provide us a lot of information. Moving on. Next, we go to museums. So I'm sure you all must have visited some museum at some point of time. What do museum do? They have many artifacts on display which hold immense cultural and social heritage for our country. It helps us to understand the history. Sometimes there are some private collectors who then donate whatever they have collected to the museums where they can be on display. So here we can find coins, we can find old notes. We can also find old type of crockery, old type of utensils, the old type of clothes, the artillery, the weapons used. So it gives us a lot of information. So here in Maharashtra, we have the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Museum at Mumbai, which is very, very famous. Now next we come to folk tales. Folk tales are, the stories that are very traditional, which have been told from one generation to the other. So it is passed on and on and on. So generation after generation, folk tales are passed. They are nothing but stories basically to interest the small children. And now one very peculiar fact or one very characteristic trait of folk tales is that in the tales there will be something about our culture which is indirectly passed on from one generation to another. So it talks about your culture. These are not fictional stories or any story like Pinocchio, who's lying and his nose increases and then he starts saying the truth and the nose decreases. Not those kind of fairy tales. Folk tales which pass on something that's important to us culturally, from one generation to the next. So these are some pictures of folk tales now. Also here you can see this is like a Yamraj who's this guy is dead, he's lying on the floor, and maybe his wife is praying to this god Yamraj. So this is a story that we've heard many times from our parents, or we've heard it on TV or at least somewhere, but we are aware of this fact. So again the folktale reinforces these facts so that we do not forget our culture. This is very famous. It's Buddha gaining enlightenment. So this is what folk tales show you. Folk tales are oral sources of information. They're passed on orally. They are not written down. Even if they are written down, it will be a very, very recent phenomenon. But they are passed on orally. Next, last part of this chapter, we come to the Film and Television Institute of India. Now, what this does is, it was started by the government of India. It has its headquarters at Pune in 1960. It aims to provide national education, aims to provide public education, and touches important events in politics, social issues, art, sports, and culture. So it is obviously for entertainment, but here it is trying to give us a lot of important information through entertainment. It's not like our normal series and normal serials and movies and time pass things that go on. But yes, it mainly concentrates on documentaries, wherein it provides a really vital information to the people who are trying to study the history. So this is your chapter on this is its logo, FTII, Film and Television Institute of India. So that's what this chapter does is it tells you about the sources of history. So let's quickly take a recap. So these are sources, we have written and we have material. Written sources, we are mainly concentrating on newspaper and postage stamps. Material sources, we are mainly concentrating on coins and museums in this chapter. So as we go through the course, we'll definitely be reflecting on each one at some point of time. These are newspapers, we exactly know what purpose they solve. The first newspaper published in India, the PTI and what it does, postage stamps, their relevance. Coming to coins, very, very important source, material source, museums, folk tales, and FTII, and have it presents documentaries which are historically based. So yes, this was the first chapter of history that we did sources. Very easy to understand. You've already done it at some point of the time. So that's it. Is anyone having any doubts in this chapter? Anything that somebody did not understand, somebody joined late and wants to know something? I'm giving you 2 minutes to reflect on it. If you have any doubts, please let me know, or else we start with our next topic for the day. Okay, so I do not think that any of you has any doubt. So let's move on to the next chapter. It's called India Events After 1960. Now this chapter and the chapter after this, it's a little related. It talks about the unrest in India or the problems India was facing immediately after independence, who were the different prime ministers, and what they tried to do to deal with these differences and to restore peace in our country. So that's what these two chapters are telling you. If we had any external threats, if we had any internal threats, and how these threats were dealt with, because obviously all threats did not come at once, they came over different points of time. Now, obviously, at these different points of time, our prime ministers were very, very different. And so, what happened during their rule, and how did they try and solve these issues, and how they brought peace back to our country? So, now the first thing that you need to understand when it comes to independence is that Indian independence paid a very heavy price. It was not something, yes, we were happy that we got independent, but some people were not really happy about it. In fact, after independence, they had to go through a lot of problems. They personally had to face a lot of problems. Apart from that, our country as a whole had to face a lot of problems. Now, just who started ruling once India got independent? Obviously, just one political party, that was the Indian National Congress. Okay, so it is the INC that ruled our country in the beginning. We knew that we wanted to become a democratic country, but how to be democratic, how to continue being democratic, how to be a strong democratic country was something that was questionable and something that was debatable. Now, at this time, you need to understand that our leaders also, they were not born leaders. Yes, they were leaders, they knew what to do, but they themselves were trying to figure out many things of how to go about things. So these things for them were really very, very difficult. Many issues, India is a land of diversity. There was so much of diversity that if you do something for one community, the other community would feel alienated. They would have 10 problems arising out of that. We had the issues of SCs and STs, that is your scheduled caste and scheduled tribes. We have a new constitution and we are still trying to figure out if it's the perfect constitution that we could have made. So yes, everybody during this point of time was just trying to figure out what is to be done and how it is to be done. So the partition was a very heavy price that we paid for independence. A lot of people, billions of people died, lost their lives, became homeless. We had the problem of refugees, and all these issues gave a lot of problems. So now when we talk about independence, there are three main issues that we concentrate on: economic, political, and social. So when it comes to the economic problems, to deal with the economic problems, our country or our leaders emphasized on the planning commission and industrialization. They thought that now if we have more and more industries, more and more people can gain employment, and so our poverty issue can be slowly and steadily sorted one after the other. So, and for this, it started the planning commission. Now we know that planning is a very essential prerequisite. It's a very essential condition for anything. Planning, even if you want to study, you need to plan that how I'm going to study. So imagine how much you need to plan for a country. So the planning commission, giving you some information on this, the planning commission was formed on 15th of March 1950. Headquarters obviously in Delhi. Now remember one thing which is very important, that the Prime Minister of our country is the ex officio chairman of the commission. So whoever is the Prime Minister will be the chairman of the Planning Commission also. Now other members of the Planning Commission would also include some cabinet ministers like Finance Minister, Agriculture Minister, Home Minister, etc. Apart from this, it will also have members who are experts in the fields of economics, science, technology, industry, administration. So it has the experts and it has some ministers. Now, obviously, because the Prime Minister is the chairman of the Planning Commission, so obviously the first chairman of the Planning Commission was our first Prime Minister, that is Mr. Jawaharlal Nehru. Now, we still have the Planning Commission in our country, but the only thing is it has been renamed by Mr. Narendra Modi. So he kind of dissolved the Planning Commission on 17th of August 2014, and he replaced the Planning Commission with Niti Aayog. NITI stands for National Institution for Transforming India. It was formed on 1st of January 2015. Again, it had its headquarters at Delhi. Now, with the changing times, the goals also change of the Planning Commission. The trends change, the ways of development change. So, its current aim is to achieve sustainable development and enhance federalism. So federalism means basically strengthening the governance and the administration in our country. The current agency executives, obviously chairman will be our Prime Minister, that is Narendra Modi. Vice Chairman is Rajiv Kumar, and the CEO is Mr. Amitabh Kant, who is an IAS officer. So this is our Planning Commission, which was made to sort out the economic issues that we had in our country. The second big issue that we had in our country were the political issues. Now, the only way to deal with political issues was that our leaders strengthen democracy as much as they can, because that was the only way to bring faith in people, to bring hope in people, to gain the trust of people. Politically, the best thing that a government can do for a people is hold elections and give people the right to vote, universal adult franchise. So somewhere or the other, if I'm voting as a citizen of the country, I have this thing in mind that even if it's a very small part, yes, I am playing that part. I'm doing that role of being a responsible citizen. So politically, the leaders tried to conduct elections successfully and solve the political issues in our country. And obviously, as successful elections would be held every 5 years, our democracy would also keep on strengthening. But as we go through the chapter, you will realize that how unstable the Indian government has been. Now, lastly, the third important issue that we had were the social issues. Now, to deal with social issues, the government took many steps, our leaders took many steps, like they made many policies and programs for the weaker sections of society. Now, the kind of social issues that one would face is poverty, which would be both a social and an economic issue, unemployment, family issues. Um, Other than that, issues like problems faced by particular communities in our country, what to do with the scheduled castes, what to do with the scheduled tribes, should we give them reservation or no? If we should give them reservation, how long should we give them reservation? And what percentage of reservation should follow? In what type of institutes or in all type of institutes should we give reservation? So these were some of the things that the government needed to decide on. Okay. So now we'll be studying this chapter part by part. By part, I mean we will go prime minister by prime minister and what are the important things that happened during their rule or while they were in power. Okay. So now our first prime minister was Mr. Jawaharlal Nehru.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yes.
Can you please share the screen?
Yeah, I have no PPT for this. So I'm just explaining you verbally.
Yeah, ma'am. Ma'am, I thought PPT was there. Sorry, ma'am.
Yeah. No issues. It's okay. Completely fine. Okay, so let's go. Now we are starting with Prime Minister number one, Mr. Jawaharlal Nehru. One thing that I want you all to remember is that in the year 1935, the Britishers passed the Government of India Act. As per this act, one of the most important provisions was that it allowed the country, that is, it allowed India to have a constituent assembly which could start drafting a constitution for our country. Now, the Constituent Assembly had one small part within it, which was the drafting committee, which was headed by Dr. Ambedkar. So now this Constituent Assembly becomes our first Lok Sabha. Okay, so you need to remember that this Constituent Assembly becomes our first Lok Sabha. Now, what happened during Jawaharlal Nehru's rule? Now, he was the first Prime Minister of India. Okay, was the first and the longest serving Prime Minister of our country till today. Hopefully, he would be taken over by Mr. Narendra Modi very soon. Giving you some information on Mr. Narendra Modi, Mr. Jawaharlal Nehru. He was born on 14th November 1889 and died on 27th of May 1964 due to a heart attack. So it was a natural death. He served as the Prime Minister of our country from 1947 to 1964, which is a period of almost 18 years. First, he was the PM of the interim government, and then after 1951, he was the proper Prime Minister of the Indian Republic. Now, what do you mean by an interim government? An interim government is a temporary government. Okay. For example, the Britishers overnight they just left our country. That time the partition was going on. There was no time for elections. So what happens is till the condition becomes stable, till the condition becomes favorable for elections, what we do is we have an interim government, which is a temporary government. तो जब होगा तब proper situation होगी तब we will have elections. Till then, this is the temporary government, the interim government that is going to look after the functioning of the country. So first he was the Prime Minister of interim government and then he became the Prime Minister of the Indian Republic. Now we are looking at some important events that happened during his rule. Now the first important event that happened during his rule was the freedom or evacuation of Goa, Daman and Diu by the foreign powers. Now we need to remember that even though we know that the Britishers ruled India, the entire continent or subcontinent, the entire subcontinent was not ruled by Britishers. We had the Portuguese and the Dutch as well, ruling side by side the Britishers. So Goa, Daman and Diu was under the Portuguese, and the Portuguese rule lasted for about 450 years. Now, if you go to Goa, you can see that it is heavily influenced by uh, Portuguese culture, Portuguese cuisine, Portuguese architecture. A lot of churches that you see in Goa are influenced by the Portuguese architecture. Finally, in the year 1961, so that's like 13-14 years after independence, the Indian Army finally invaded and annexed Goa. It was a 36-hour battle between the Indian Army and the Portuguese. Finally, Goa became free from Portuguese rule on 19th of December 1961. So this is how we, did away with the Portuguese. 1961. So after so many years of independence, we finally got the territories of Goa, Daman and Diu. Now the region of Goa, Daman and Diu were incorporated as union territories first. After that, Goa was given statehood and Goa became a state in 1987. So 30th of May 1987, Goa became a state and then Daman and Diu were separated from Goa and now they are a union territory. So now they continue to be union territories. So this is one important event that happened during Jawaharlal Nehru's rule. The second very significant event was the Indo-China War. Okay. This took place in the year 1962, also known as the Sino-Indian War or the Indo-China War. Now, it resulted as a dispute. What happened is there were many reasons for the failure of this war. We lost the Indo-China War in the year 1962. Now, why did the war take place first of all? There was a dispute over the Aksai Chin region in the Arunachal Pradesh area. Now, Arunachal Pradesh shares its borders directly with China. So, over the border, there was some issue. The Chinese claimed that this Aksai Chin region belongs to us. The Indian said that no, the Britishers have drawn a line and that this area belongs to us. So it was that fight. The Chinese said that no, the Britishers have gone away. We do not know anything. This is our territory. And all of this resulted in a war. So finally, this war began on 20th of October 1962 and it lasted till 21st November 1962, almost a year, and it resulted in Chinese victory. Now, India lost because of many reasons. The first and the most important reason was that Jawaharlal Nehru blindly trusted the Chinese. All our other leaders kept on warning Jawaharlal Nehru that, see, ultimately it's a foreign country, though you trust them, but you cannot trust them blindly. You know, we need to have our soldiers on that border every time. But because Nehru was so confident with the Chinese that he did not post a lot of army on the Indo-China border. There was comparatively very little army over there. Also at this time, the slogan was made very popular by Jawaharlal Nehru that Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai. And all of these things went for a toss when finally China declared war on India. We were unprepared for the war. Our army was not prepared. It was a sudden attack. Plus, as I said, there was hardly any army on the Indo-China border. Air Force was not used. They attacked us on all the possible fronts. From wherever the Chinese could attack us, they attacked us. Nehru overtrusted the Chinese. We had weak leadership at that time. Obviously, we had 10 other issues. The war just aggravated everything. And, you know, in this war, around 1383, 1383 soldiers became martyrs, means they lost their lives. Over 1,000 soldiers were injured. Almost 4,000 soldiers were taken as prisoners of war. And 1,600 people, including soldiers, they went missing. And India lost 42,735 kilometers of area. So this was a huge defeat for India. We very badly lost the Indo-China war. So these are the two most significant events that happened during Jawaharlal Nehru's rule in India. That is unification of Goa, Daman and Diu with India and the Indo-China war. Now, the presidents that ruled during Nehru's rule, we had two presidents at this time. Obviously, our first president, Rajendra Prasad, and then Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan. Now, Nehru suddenly died of an heart attack. And so, till the next elections are held, we again needed to have an interim government. And the prime minister of this interim government was Gulzari Lal Nanda from 27th May to 9th June 1964. So just a period of like 1.5 to 2 weeks, we had an interim prime minister who was Gulzari Lal Nanda. After this, can anyone tell me who was our second prime minister?
Lal Bahadur Shastri.
Yes, Lal Bahadur Shastri. Any important events that you remember associated with him? He hardly ruled from 1964 to 1966. Just 1.5 years. So Lal Bahadur Shastri became the second Prime Minister of India. So from 9th June 1964 to 11th January 1966, where he died at Tashkent in Russia. The very famous slogan, Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan, was given by Lal Bahadur Shastri. This slogan shows the importance that he gave to the Jawans and the Kisans, that is soldiers and the farmers. He thought that they are the backbones of our country. Our entire country relies on the soldiers and the farmers. Now, just one, because his rule was so short-lived, just one important event or a very significant event took place during his rule. That was the Indo-Pakistan War in 1965. Now the war was not so long. It lasted from August till 23rd September 1965. Again, over what issue are we still fighting today? The Jammu and Kashmir issue. So the war was fought over the same issue. The war was fought on LOC, on the Radcliffe Line, on Sir Creek, on Zero Point, Arabian Sea, East Pakistan border. So it was fought on many fronts. So it was a full-blown war. Finally, the UN intervened. The United Nations organizations interfere, and they said कि अभी बस करो. They mandated ceasefire. Okay, which means that they told them, please both of you stop fighting. So when the UN intervened, finally both the sides stopped fighting and they both claimed victory. Pakistan said we are victorious, India said we are victorious. So there was no particular winner in this Indo-Pak War of 1965. Both of them claimed victory. Now America and Russia, they both interfered in the war. Why did they interfere in the war? To bring about peace in the world. So finally, we know that at the end of war, there is always a treaty or a peace agreement. So similarly, India and Pakistan signed a peace agreement. From India, it was signed by our Prime Minister, that is Lal Bahadur Shastri, and Pakistan, it was signed by the Pakistani President, that is Mr. Muhammad Ayub Khan, on 10th of January 1966 at Tashkent, which was known as the Tashkent Declaration. The President of India during Lal Bahadur Shastri's rule was Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan. Again, because Lal Bahadur Shastri suddenly died, his death, though claimed to be a natural death, is not actually a natural death. Just a second. Okay, so Lal Bahadur Shastri did not die a natural death in reality. He was murdered. Now it's a big thing, a big scandal, you can say, that has been classified for so many years by the Indian government. So he died suddenly. After that, obviously, it takes some time to set up a new government and have elections. So again, we had an interim government, and for the second time, we had the same guy as the interim prime minister, that is Gulzari Lal Nanda, from 11th January to 24th January 1966. Okay. So these are our first two prime ministers, Nehru and then Lal Bahadur Shastri. Now, Lal Bahadur Shastri's death has been very, very debatable. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie The Tashkent Declaration. If not, you must definitely see it. You will realize that how it's like 80% correct that he has been, murdered, and he has been the, the focus. He has had some problems, and so he faced these problems, and because of that, he had to die. Till today, his family does not know why he died. They have been given no clear answers on this. Very, very debatable death. You must watch that movie. It will make a lot of facts clear. Another important things were that Lal Bahadur Shastri supported the Amul Milk Cooperative movement, the milk campaign that we had. He promoted the white revolution a lot. So he was a very liked prime minister. Actually, people were very happy that Lal Bahadur Shastri had come to power. But finally, he was killed, and after that, we have Indira Gandhi coming to power, who rules for a very long time, known as one of the most dynamic prime ministers of our country. So in the next class, we will concentrate on Indira Gandhi. Now, Indira Gandhi served 2 terms as president. She serves India in 2 parts. The first part is she comes to power after Lal Bahadur Shastri's death and becomes the 3rd Prime Minister of our country. So at that time, in her part 1 of her rule, she rules from 1966 to 1977. After that, she rules from 1980 to 1984, after which again she is killed by the Sikhs that were her bodyguards. So Indira Gandhi has been the first and the only woman Prime Minister of India, and she has served twice as the Prime Minister of our country. Now, initially, when Lal Bahadur Shastri was the Prime Minister, she already was a member of the Rajya Sabha and she became the Minister of Information and Broadcasting in the next general elections that were held in the year 1966 following Lal Bahadur Shastri's death. This time she came to power, and then from this 24th January 1966, she ruled till 24th March 1977. A lot of important events took place during her rule, which we will be reflecting on in the next class. Just to brief you up, there was the Indo-Pak War again in the year 1971, which led to the making of Bangladesh. She proclaimed the emergency, because of which she lost popularity. The first atomic device was tested during her rule, though it proved to be a failure. It was tested for the first time during her rule. During the second part of her rule from 1980 to 1984, the Operation Khalistan and the independent Khalistan movement, the Operation Blue Star movement took place, which is very interesting to know. So we'll be reflecting upon all these things in our next class. So we'll end the class for today over here. Now, if any of you have any doubts, please unmute yourself and you can ask me all your doubts. And if you all have no doubts, you can leave the session.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Welcome. See you.
Bye, ma'am.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye,
ma'am.
ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Welcome. Bye.